Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, October 12th, 2022. The United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly passes a resolution condemning Russia for trying to illegally annex parts of Ukraine during its ongoing invasion. General Mark Milley, chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, calling the Russian missile strikes this past week against civilian targets in multiple Ukrainian cities a war crime. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zielinski telling leaders at the IMF World Bank meeting how much financial assistance his country will need if the war with Russia goes into next year. Also today, more questions to President Joe Biden about how he might respond to Saudi Arabia after Saudi Arabia joined Russia in the OPEC Plus group, cutting oil production and therefore raising gas prices. President also traveling to Colorado, naming his first national monument protecting federal land. The U.S. Supreme Court hears a case involving the art of the late Andy Warhol, asking the question, when is art that takes from other work only inspired by it, or a ripoff that violates copyright law? And in Great Britain, Parliament back after a break following the death of Queen Elizabeth. We'll touch base with C-SPAN's Westminster producer, Peter Knowles, about the fight over the budget there. Now to the United Nations in New York City and the vote on a resolution condemning the Russian Federation for holding what the resolution calls illegal so-called referenda in 4 regions in eastern Ukraine and in using the results of those referenda to annex those regions. Today's vote comes after 2 days of debate spread over the week, Monday and today, during which the ambassadors from several dozen countries spoke in favor of affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, and a few spoke against the resolution. One of the final speakers today from the United States, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield.
Colleagues, the facts are clear. A UN member state, one with a permanent seat on the Security Council, has attempted to annex territory from its neighbor by force. This UN member state has not only put its neighbor in its crosshairs, but also put a bullseye in this institution's core principle. One country cannot take the territory of another by force. 8 years ago, the General Assembly was asked to respond to the same UN member state's attempted annexation of Crimea. Back then, the General Assembly defended the UN Charter. We overwhelmingly adopted a resolution affirming Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We must do the same today. As in 2014, Russia is testing the resolve of the world to stand up for the core principles of international law. How else do you explain the flagrant disregard of the values of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peace and security? How else do you explain the horrific attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure that we've seen this week? How else do you explain the saber-rattling from Putin and his veiled threats of deploying nuclear force? These are threats against this institution. They are threats against all of us.
Linda Thomas-Greenfield is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at today's debate at the UN General Assembly in New York City before the vote approving the resolution condemning Russia for trying to annex portions of Ukraine. A similar resolution failed last week at the United Nations Security Council due to Russia's veto, but there is no veto available in the entire UN General Assembly. The Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, spoke against today's resolution.
On September 28th, the final results of the referendums were tallied, and the vast majority of those who voted, that is 99% at the DPR, 98% in the LPR, 93% in Zaporizhia, and 87% in the Kherson region, supported the idea of these regions becoming a part of Russia. Despite the difficult security situation and the provocations of the Kiev regime, the vast majority of voters decided to cast their vote, ranging from 76% in the Kherson region to 97% in the DPR. The results of the vote speak for themselves. The populations of these regions do not want to return to Ukraine and have made an informed and free choice in favor of our country.
Through an interpreter, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, at today's UN General Assembly. After all the speeches were completed, the vote was taken, and when the final number came up on the screen, there was applause, and then the announcement of the vote by the President of the General Assembly.
The results of the vote is as follows. In favor, 143, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES11L/L5 is adopted.
Csaba Kőrösi is President of the United Nations General Assembly. A story from Reuters. A Russian nuclear strike would change the course of the conflict and almost certainly trigger a physical response from Ukraine allies and potentially from NATO, a senior NATO official said on Wednesday. Any use of nuclear weapons by Moscow would have unprecedented consequences for Russia, the official warned. It would almost certainly be drawing a physical response from many allies and potentially from NATO itself, he said. That from Reuters. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is at NATO headquarters for the defense ministerial meeting today of NATO's 30 members. Also invited Sweden and Finland, who are on their way to becoming members. And joining the Defense Secretary, General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and together they also held a meeting of the Ukraine Contact Group. That's nearly 50 countries working together to support Ukraine in the war against Russia. The two, Defense Secretary Austin and General Milley, held a news conference. General Milley saying point blank that Russia's missile strikes on Ukrainian cities over the past week are a war crime.
Russia has chosen in response to escalate with a recent mobilization of 300,000 call-ups for conscripts. They have tried to conduct an illegal annexation of 4 of the oblasts in occupied Ukraine. They have increased their rhetoric to include rhetoric about nuclear weapons. And of course, in the past few days, Russia has increased their strikes on civilian infrastructure, power generation, and dams. Russia has deliberately struck civilian infrastructure with the purpose of harming civilians. They have targeted the elderly, the women, and the children of Ukraine. Indiscriminate and deliberate attacks on civilians targets is a war crime in the international rules of war.
General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at a news conference at NATO in Brussels, Belgium. One of the reporters there was from Ukraine, and he asked the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, also at the news conference, about promised additional air defense weapons the U.S. and allied countries say they'll be sending to Ukraine to defend against the Russian missiles hitting those civilian areas.
We'll go to Vladimir Zielinski from ICTV.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm one of those who this Monday, wasn't sure that I would be able to be here because of the airstrikes that we experienced in Kiev. And the question I'm going to ask is not mine. It's the people of Ukraine would like to ask you, when will they be able to just sleep well and not be afraid to leave their families behind and go on a trip like this? Because I'm here and I'm really anxious about what is happening to my family back home. So when are the systems going to be provided, and is there a possibility that the sky is going to be safe?
The short answer to your question, sir, is the systems will be provided as fast as we can physically get them there. And this is something, as I said at the top, that we remain focused on. And we're going to provide systems that we have available, that countries like Germany has available. We're also going to try to provide additional munitions to the existing systems that the Ukrainian forces are using. As long as there's the conflict goes on, there will always be uncertainty. So it's very difficult to predict exactly when it's going to be safe to move in and out of the country. And I know that you're concerned about your family. and you certainly that's understandable. But we're going to do everything we can as fast as we can to help the Ukrainian forces get the capability they need to protect the Ukrainian people. That's very, very important to us. And by the way, it was important to all the 50 members that were in that meeting today and their chiefs of defense. And this is, the utility of this Ukraine Defense Contact Group. I just can't. I can't overemphasize how useful this is, because it helps us to address current near-term problems and mobilize resources much faster than we otherwise would be able to. And again, I don't want to exaggerate this point, but I have to tell you that I remain impressed by the commitment of the members of the group. And for the most part, these are ministers of defense that show up to every meeting. And not surrogates.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at today's news conference with the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the U.S., General Mark Milley, at NATO headquarters in Belgium. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zielinski outlining the economic assistance that he says his country needs as it continues its fight against Russia. Zielinski speaking virtually to a meeting on the sidelines of the World Bank International Monetary Fund conference that's happening in Washington, D.C.
We can see that Russian terroristic attacks can be intensified, so we need to intensify our collaboration for assistance in a symmetric way to rebuild what was destroyed and to guarantee the financial stability of our state. You know the data from this year. Russian terror has caused Ukraine's economy reduction by more than 1/3. Likewise, real incomes of our people are reduced by 1/3. Thousands of businesses and infrastructural objects were destroyed, and millions of people became displaced. At this time, we have two key financial needs of the country. That's $38 billion to make up for the deficit of our budget for next year. That includes salaries of doctors and teachers, social payments and pensions. That's guarantees of Ukrainian people's survival. And other $17 billion that were verified by the World Bank and needed to rebuild the critical infrastructure in the RDNA framework. Those are schools, hospitals, critical transport and energy infrastructure, also damaged housing. In fact, all that became Russia's priority targets for their strikes. We need also targeted credits in the amount of $2 billion to rebuild the electric energy infrastructure after the destruction and to expand our export to Europe. Also, taking into account the crisis situation created by Russia all across the continent, we need credit limits to purchase gas and coal for the future heating season. The scope of this year's support should be not less than $5 billion.
Through an interpreter, the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zielinski, speaking virtually to a roundtable meeting on the sidelines of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank meeting happening in Washington. Attending today's meeting, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. The IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, estimating today that Ukraine will need $3 billion to $4 billion per month in help in 2023 if the war continues. This year, grant and loan commitments around the world to Ukraine, $35 billion. After Saudi Arabia joined Russia and other nations in the OPEC Plus group in announcing oil production cuts starting next month of 2 million barrels a day, they say it's aimed at stabilizing the oil market and preparing for an expected drop in demand because of the world economy. But most analysts say it's going to raise oil and gas prices in the short term. Some top Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress calling for banning arm exports from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia. In a moment, we'll hear from a senator who introduced a bill today. First, President Biden, in a CNN interview Tuesday night, saying only that Saudi Arabia will be facing consequences.
We should, and I am, in the process when the this House and Senate gets back, they're going to have to, there's going to be some consequences for what they've done with Russia.
What kind of consequences? Menendez says suspend all arms sales. Is that something you'd consider?
I'm not going to get into what I'd consider and what I have in mind, but there will be consequences.
President Biden with CNN's Jake Tapper referring to Senator Robert Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And today, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre getting follow-up questions from reporters during a flight on Air Force One.
Can you give any updates on the president's thinking and the White House's thinking about recalibrating the relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, the president was asked this. I think you guys may have heard right before he took off, and he was clearly asked this last night. Look, I know folks have been asking about a timeline. Look, as he said last night, as he said this morning, when the House and the Senate get back, we'll discuss and make decisions in a deliberate way. But he was very clear. There will be consequences. We believe the decision that OPEC Plus made last week was a mistake, and it was short-sighted. And so we have said, and I said this yesterday during the briefing, that from the beginning the president has talked about recalibrating, readjusting our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and now we're going to get into a process where we'll review that and we'll have more to share on that.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters flying on Air Force One with the president. AAA says that gas prices in the U.S. averaging today $3.92. That's up 9 cents in a week. On Capitol Hill, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, introducing a bill to stop, for now, arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
He said there need to be consequences. We agree completely. One of the consequences should be a temporary halt in arms sales. This 1-year pause in sales of all arms, repairs, supplies, support, really is in defense of our national interest and security interests. The long and short is the Saudis need to come to their senses. They have committed a humongous blunder, very much against their own economic and security interests as well as ours. The only apparent purpose of this cut in oil supplies is to help the Russians and harm Americans. It was unprovoked and unforced as an error. The Saudis were making windfall returns. Only the Russians were making less profitable returns. And now we need to rebalance our relationship, and the Saudis need to restore trust. So this effort hopefully will begin a path toward rebalancing that one-sided relationship. And there are larger security concerns here because the Saudis' actions aid and abet a murderous and brutal criminal invasion by Russia. They endanger the world economy, and they threaten higher gas prices for Americans at the pump. But it's more than oil that is at stake here. It's also human rights abuses, butchering journalists, fostering civil war in Yemen, failing to respect our 9/11 victims in this country. And that is part of the context for what we are proposing here. There's a national security concern because we are selling highly sensitive advanced technology to a country that has aligned itself with an adversary, Russia, that is committing terrorist war crimes in Ukraine. And so there's a moral imperative, but also a national security imperative.
Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, at a news conference on Capitol Hill. He was joined by Congressman Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, introducing a companion bill in the House to ban those arms sales to Saudi Arabia temporarily. TheHill.com reports that momentum is building in Congress in support of legislation that would take on the OPEC Plus group of oil-producing nations. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer recently floated using legislation known as NOPEC as one way to respond. NOPEC would enable the Justice Department to bring lawsuits against the OPEC Plus countries and their state-owned oil companies under U.S. antitrust laws. NOPEC in the bill, an acronym for No Oil Producing and Exporting Cartels Act. The Biden administration releasing today its report to Congress on the president's national security strategy. The president writing, "We are in the midst of a strategic competition to shape the future of the international order." The report says that China and Russia pose the biggest challenges to international peace and stability, but in different ways, and there are also challenges that are not tied to any one country. The National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talking about it at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service.
Simply put, we face two main strategic challenges. The first is geopolitical competition. The post-Cold War era is over, and the competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. The United States, we believe, is better positioned than any other nation in the world to seize this moment, to help set the rules, shore up the norms, and advance the values that will define the world we want to live in. But we are not on this field alone. The PRC's assertiveness at home and abroad is advancing an illiberal vision across economic, political, security, and technological realms in competition with the West. It is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and the growing capacity to do it. Meanwhile, Russia's war against Ukraine builds on years of growing regional aggression. Vladimir Putin is making reckless nuclear threats, willfully violating the UN Charter, relentlessly targeting civilians, acting with a brutality that threatens to drag us all back into the dark days of Soviet expansionism. The second strategic challenge we face is the sheer scale and speed of transnational challenges that do not respect borders or adhere to ideologies. Climate change, which is already destroying lives and livelihoods in every part of the world. Food insecurity, the energy transition, and now, as we know all too well, diseases and pandemics like COVID-19. Our strategy proceeds from the premise that the two strategic challenges, geopolitical competition and shared transnational threats, are intertwined. We cannot build broad coalitions we need to outcompete our rivals if we sideline the issues that most directly impact the lives of billions of people.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service today. The National Security Strategy is a report to Congress that's been mandated by a law since 1986, and the White House has posted this latest version at their website, whitehouse.gov. It runs 48 pages. A story about Haiti in Associated Press. The Prime Minister and 18 members of his cabinet have requested the immediate deployment of foreign troops in response to gangs and protesters who have paralyzed the country. Fuel, water, and other basic supplies have dwindled nearly a month after one of Haiti's most powerful gangs blocked access to a main fuel terminal in Port-au-Prince. In addition, demonstrators have blocked roads in the capital and other main cities to demand the Prime Minister's resignation and protest rising fuel prices after the Prime Minister announced in early September that his administration could no longer afford to subsidize fuel. Reaction from the U.S. State Department spokesman, Ned Price.
As a result of the evolving health and security situation in Haiti, Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs Brian Nichols is leading a high-level U.S. interagency delegation to Haiti today to discuss urgent humanitarian needs in the country. The United States notes with great concern the growing cholera epidemic and the prolonged gang-imposed fuel blockade. We are in receipt of the government of Haiti's appeal for urgent international armed security assistance to address the current humanitarian crisis in Haiti, and the Secretary General's letter urging support for such a force. We are currently reviewing this request in coordination with international partners. Right now, however, our staff is on the ground in Haiti, working alongside Haitian health workers and NGOs to respond to the cholera outbreak and deliver care to those who need it. We will accelerate delivery of additional humanitarian relief to the people of Haiti. The United States government recognizes the role armed gangs and criminal actors play in disrupting the free flow of fuel, humanitarian supplies, and life-saving services for the Haitian people. As a friend of Haiti, the United States government is accelerating our diplomatic, humanitarian, and security response. We are coordinating with international partners as well as within our own government to increase security assistance that will facilitate the movement of humanitarian relief. We will do our part, bilaterally and multilaterally, to hold accountable criminal actors who impede the provision of humanitarian assistance.
State Department spokesman Ned Price, as part of holding those responsible accountable, Ned Price also announcing the U.S. government will rescind visas belonging to current and former Haitian government officials involved with criminal organizations. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The January 6th committee returns Thursday for its 9th hearing, ahead of the release of their written report, expected by the end of the year. You can watch the hearing live, beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or anytime, on demand at cspan.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app. A few more headlines. FDA and CDC approving the updated COVID-19 booster shots that target the Omicron variant of the virus for young children. The Pfizer-BioNTech modified vaccine for those 5 years and older, and Moderna shot for 6 years and older. And NASA will try again to launch the Artemis 1 mission on November 14th. This is the first major test for the program aimed at eventually sending astronauts back to the moon for the first time in 50 years. 2 previous attempts at the test launch were aborted due to technical problems, and it was also postponed by Hurricane Ian. C-SPAN's Campaign 2022 coverage includes not only state governors and U.S. senators' races, but also some of the closely watched U.S. House contests that will determine which party controls that chamber after the November 8th election. One of the seats is Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. Today, a debate between the incumbent Elaine Luria, Democrat, and the challenger Republican State Senator Jen Kiggins. WKTR-TV in Norfolk, Virginia reports the closely watched election is considered a toss-up by several election websites, and redistricting has made the district more Republican. After an hour and a half of debate, here are the closing statements by the candidates.
As we've gone through different issues today, there's a few things I've thought of. And a lot of times people stand up here and say, this is why you should vote for me. And I think my track record shows clearly the results that I've given to the 2nd District, not only at the national level with legislation we've talked about, but things such as public safety, commitments, investments on the Eastern Shore, they speak for themselves. And I'll tell you, there's certain cases where I'm not your candidate. I am not your candidate if you think the election was stolen. I'm not your candidate if you think that $70 million of state taxpayer money should go to a forensic audit of the 2020 election in a state that Biden won by 10 points and there's no hint of election fraud. I'm not your candidate if you want to criticize the FBI for doing their job and enforcing federal law. I'm not your candidate if you stand with insurrectionists. I'm not your candidate if you'd rather have Donald J. Trump as president again, because you're so critical of Biden, you obviously supported Donald Trump. And I'm not your candidate if you think that you know what's best for women rather than allowing them to make their own choices. And I'm certainly not your candidate if you don't believe that America continues to have the strongest military in the world. So what I would say is that serving in Congress is a very difficult and rewarding job. And we haven't had a lot of time to talk right through this about the interactions that we have with constituents. But, all of this said and done, it's all about the people. And it's all about the people who I see about in the community and come up to me and they say, thank you for what you've done. And fill in the blank. Thank you for what you've done for my father who's a disabled veteran. Thank you for what you've done for the environment. Thank you for what you've done to stand up for our democracy. And I would just say to those people who've supported me in 2018 and 2020, thank you for supporting me. I ask for your support again. I will continue the hard work that I've done. I will continue to deliver Virginia's 2nd District, and I will continue to stand up for our democracy.
Thank you, Congresswoman Luria. Senator Kiggins, final remarks, 2 minutes, 20 seconds.
My entire life has been about service. Service to my country as a Navy pilot, service to my family as a mom of 4 and a Navy wife, and service to my community as a geriatric nurse practitioner and a state senator. You've all been able to hear both of our views, not just on business issues, but also our vision for our community and our country and what motivates us to run. Each election year, my opponent campaigns as a moderate, but in between elections, she doesn't vote like a moderate. She votes like Nancy Pelosi. The first vote she casts is for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, and then she continues to vote with Pelosi 99% of the time. If you all take away nothing else from today, I want you to take away that statistic. When I knock on doors, talk to moms in carpool lines, neighbors in civic league meetings, or business leaders like many of you, and ask what is driving people to vote this year, the response I usually get is we're not happy with the direction of our country. Then they tell me about the economy and how much they pay to fill their tanks, how much it costs to feed their families, and how much less they have in their savings account. Hardworking Americans are hurting from Joe Biden's disastrous failed economic policies. In the 2nd Congressional District, these policies go by the name of Elaine Luria, who votes for them 99% of the time. The wasteful spending and tax increases must stop. The government mandates and expansion into our lives and businesses must stop. To stop these things and get our country back on track, we must have a change of leadership in Congress. And in the 2nd District, that starts with flipping the seat and firing Nancy Pelosi. My campaign has been focused on the economy, the border, our children's education, crime, and our military, while my opponent has run a one-issue smear campaign based on lies and unhinged television commercials. Voters will remember these things when they cast their vote on November 8th. Thank you for the opportunity to serve my community, my district, and my country in government. It is the honor of a lifetime and a responsibility that I do not take lightly. I ask for your vote, and I look forward to serving as the next Congresswoman from the 2nd Congressional District.
State Senator Jen Kiggins, a Republican, debating Congresswoman Elaine Luria, a Democrat, Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. They debated in Virginia Beach. It was sponsored by the Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce. You can find all of C-SPAN's Campaign 2022 debates archived at our website at cspan.org. President Joe Biden today creating his first national monument, designating 54,000 acres in Colorado as a Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument. President also announcing he is prohibiting new mining claims and mineral leases on 225,000 acres in the Thompson Divide area of western Colorado for at least 2 years and possibly up to 20 years. President today was in Vail, Colorado.
President Theodore Roosevelt first used the Antiquities Act to designate a national monument. He essentially invented the national parks. Since then, presidents of both parties have used the Antiquities Act to preserve America's natural treasures, from the Grand Canyon to the Statue of Liberty, to Colorado's canyons of the ancients. Today, the authorities under the Antiquities Act, I'm establishing Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument today. This is the first new national monument of my presidency under this authority. When you think about the national beauty of Colorado and the history of our nation, you find it here. More than 50,000 acres, including the 10-mile range, soaring peaks and steep canyons, black bears, bald eagles, moose, mountain lions, waterfalls, pristine rivers, alpine lakes, a scent of wildflowers at the right time of the year, and a stunning backdrop of ski slopes and iconic trails.
President Biden today in Vail, Colorado, referring to the 1906 Antiquities Act that allows presidents to protect federal lands that contain historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, or other object of historic or scientific interest. Today's designation is the 130th time a president has done that. USA Today writes that the new Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument protects for future generations a rugged landscape in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where the legendary 10th Mountain Division trained for alpine warfare during World War II. Article also has this, though. Colorado's 3 Republican House members told the president in a September letter not to use the Antiquities Act as what they called a workaround to the Congress. A large conservation bill to protect the area, which some Republicans consider a federal land grab, has stalled in Congress. That from USA Today. On Wall Street, the Dow down 28, NASDAQ down 9, S&P down 11. Supreme Court today hearing a case that asks, as CNN reports it, whether the late Andy Warhol infringed on a photographer's copyright when he created a series of silk screens of the musician Prince. And the justice attempted to determine when a new work based on a prior piece is substantially transformative, and when it simply amounts to a copycat version of an existing work subject to copyright rules. During the oral argument, Justice Clarence Thomas revealed he was a fan of Prince. Here's that portion. You're also going to hear from Justice Elena Kagan and, arguing the case, attorney Roman Martinez.
Let's say that I'm both a Prince fan, which I was in the 80s, and... No longer? Well... So... only on Thursday night. But let's say that I'm also a Syracuse fan, and I decide to make one of those big blow-up posters of Orange Prince and change the colors a little bit around the edges and put Go Orange underneath. Would you sue me?
For infringement? Would the Warhol Foundation sue you if you were to do that?
Oh, well, you're their lawyers.
I can't comment on whether we would sue you, but I think to try to get at your question, Your Honor, I think the question of whether that would be fair use, I mean, it sounds like you're, by hypothesis, asking me to consider that there's like a different meaning or message associated with the work. I don't think that's the only part of the inquiry. I think that everyone recognizes that at Factor 1, the ultimate goal here is to figure out whether the follow-on user is doing something sort of creative.
Oh, I'm just
that
waving it, I'm waving it during the game with a big Prince face on it. Go Orange.
Yeah, I think that in circumstances like that, it's very unlikely if it was just one of you that anyone would see you.
I'm going to market it to all my Syracuse buddies.
So I think in that case, a court would quite reasonably look at that and say that this is not the kind of productive creativity promoting use that is.
So in other words, you would sue me.
No, I would not. I think that you would probably have a very weak case against me, Your Honor.
Attorney Roman Martinez at today's Supreme Court oral argument in the case Andy Warhol Foundation Incorporated v. Goldsmith. The questions from Justice Clarence Thomas and a brief interjection by Justice Elena Kagan. Another line from the CNN article about this oral argument. Several justices worried about how their eventual opinion would impact book-to-movie adaptations, motion pictures, and TV sequels. In Great Britain, the House of Commons returning from its several-week recess following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, and topic number one for the new government of Prime Minister Liz Truss of the Conservative Party is the economy, as was evident during Prime Minister's question time today. The question from opposition leader Keir Starmer of the Labour Party.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, the Business Secretary toured the TV studios arguing that the turmoil in the markets has nothing to do with her budget. Does the Prime Minister agree with him?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we have done is we have taken decisive action. We have taken decisive action to make sure that people are not facing energy bills of £6,000 for 2 years. And I think we remember the opposition is only talking about 6 months. We've also taken decisive action to make sure that we are not facing the highest taxes for 70 years in the face of a global economic slowdown. And what we're making sure is that we protect our economy at this very difficult time internationally. And as a result of our action, Mr. Speaker, and this has been independently corroborated, we will see higher growth and lower inflation.
Mr. Speaker, avoiding the question, ducking responsibility, lost in denial. No wonder investors have no confidence in her government.
Labour Party leader Keir Starmer questioning the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss during Prime Minister's Question Time in the House of Commons this morning. And joining us now from London is C-SPAN's Westminster producer Peter Knowles. Welcome again. Parliament back in session after taking a break following the death of the Queen. Already there's trouble. What's been happening?
A lot has been happening. It's hard to believe, but this was only Liz Truss's second Prime Minister's Questions of her premiership, and so much has happened over that period. With 2 days after she was elected and went to see the Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth died, and at that point politics was suspended really for 10 days for a period of national mourning. And then we had a further break, which was for the party conferences, which went pretty well for Labour, the opposition, and quite terribly for the Conservatives, the governing party. And now we're back in Parliament. Where this has its focus is something that happened on the 23rd of September, because at that point Liz Truss did what she said she was going to do, which was to bring in, through her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, a radical, exciting new approach to economics, which would be a low-tax and high-growth approach. And that was cheered by most people on her side in the House of Commons, and it was followed immediately by a very, very negative market reaction, which worried enormously. And that was the point of the question you've just heard from Keir Starmer, which is, do you accept that, to the Prime Minister, do you accept that the government in a way created the problem, which is not something that she accepted? And that's because the markets were very concerned that the tax-cutting plans were not accompanied by any detail at all of how it was going to be paid for. So without any information on how this was to be paid for, the markets took against it big time, and really a lot of trouble has followed from that, including the trouble at the party conferences. So the point of the question was really to try and pin the blame for that on the new-ish Prime Minister, and it's something, of course, that she rejected.
Was that foreseeable? I mean, new Prime Minister putting together an agenda, and then it surprises the markets? It
was partly foreseeable. Her opponent in the leadership contest predicted that if she put her plans in place as she described them in her leadership bid, then precisely this would be the reaction. But even so, even having said that, her own side, her own MPs, were genuinely surprised by how far she went, how bold it was. It was very bold. 45 billion in tax cuts, with the detail to follow as to how it was to be paid for. And what caught the eye was that the wealthiest in society were going to benefit the most. There were also tax cuts for poorer working people, but if you were at the top end, you were going to get the most benefit by some way from this budget. And I don't think her own side had quite seen it coming, that they would be quite so bold. Could they have seen it coming? The other point was that the government had sacked, apparently, the senior civil service servant in the Treasury, had published its economic plan, its taxation plans, without approval, without notes from an independent body that normally would vouchsafe for the plans. So they were being very radical and saying that caution is in the past. We need a high growth, low tax economy, and we're going to go for it in a big rush.
We're talking with Peter Knowles, C-SPAN's Westminster producer in London. There's been a lot of upheaval in the past month in Great Britain, the changeover of the monarch and a new prime minister. Will things settle down soon? Is there a possibility here?
Will things settle down? I don't think so, and I don't know any Conservative MPs who believe that they're in for a quieter period ahead. They're looking at quite awful poll ratings. Their ratings fell off a cliff after the mini-budget, and at the moment there are no safe seats for the Conservatives. They're looking at a near wipeout should a general election, unlikely though it is, be called next month. Now, of course, opinion polls are just that. They're not results. They're just a snapshot of how people are feeling and how they want to express themselves at a particular moment. But the figures are quite spectacularly awful for the governing Conservative Party, and that's making them very uncomfortable. Remember that they didn't choose Liz Truss as Prime Minister. They chose two candidates, and she was distinctly their second choice. The party membership chose her, and that draws attention to an issue in our politics, that where does legitimacy come from? Where does your mandate come from? Because both the main parties have systems where the membership get to choose the leader, but the mandate as to what leads you to being able to call yourself Prime Minister and to form a government is by commanding a majority of the MPs in the House of Commons. So the two things don't sit very comfortably together. If your party membership chooses one person, but your MPs would have chosen somebody else. This happened to Labour when they were in opposition, and it was very uncomfortable for them. And right now it's beginning to look pretty uncomfortable for the Conservatives too. So no, I don't think there's a quiet period ahead.
What else is on the agenda for the new government of the new Prime Minister?
One really big area of dispute is how growth will be achieved. This new government wants to do away with planning regulations, to reduce, rather, the impact of planning regulations. And in principle, a lot of Conservatives are behind that, but when it comes to their own neighbourhoods, they're much more worried. So that's quite a big issue. There are so many others. We still, I would say, do not have the culture wars as they're known, and as we hear about them in the United States. There's still a general consensus in many areas which do cause trouble in the politics of the U.S. But it's the economy at the moment. That's where the trouble lies, and is affecting all areas of political discourse.
And in terms of foreign affairs, especially supporting Ukraine against Russia's invasion, will anything change there?
There's a real consistency of approach behind the new government to Boris Johnson's government on Ukraine. There's been no change of direction, nor is there any significant disagreement arising with the Labour opposition on how to approach this. There's a not quite unanimity, but near unanimity on that. So foreign affairs at the moment, which is dominated by thoughts of Ukraine, is not the centre of attention.
Peter Knowles is C-SPAN's Westminster producer, joining us from London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about delivered to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.